Welcome to Healthcare IT Today. I'm John Lynn, together with my colleague and friend Colin Hung. The world of technology and healthcare ever changing in new and novel ways, and that's why we love this stuff. So join us as we discuss the latest healthcare and health IT news meshed together in new ways which help generate ideas and new perspectives. Plus, we'll have a little fun along the way. Today, we're going to be talking about resiliency and business continuity in healthcare. And today's episode is sponsored by Pure Storage, the data storage platform that grows with you forever. Learn more about how Pure Storage supports healthcare at purestorage.com/healthcare. And be sure to follow the show on social media at the hashtag HITSM and our personal accounts at TechGuy and at Colin_Hung. Plus, check out our 19 years of health IT content at healthcareittoday.com. You ever been at a company where you had a really bad incident? Your systems disappeared? I've been at a couple. Almost got fired from a job that I just started 2 weeks before, and the email system was going down all the time. And the CIO called me into the office and told me and my boss, "Hey, if you don't fix this, your jobs are on the line." And my boss appropriately said, "That's not fair to John. He just started." And he's like, "Well, I've said what I've said." And I was like, "What?" That was crazy.
No, I mean, other than, well, yes, I have been, when there was a giant blackout of the Northeast
Mm,
coast that one time, yes. So that was very interesting. But in terms of natural disasters, nothing really. Being in Toronto, we're pretty lucky that we don't really get hit with too many storms of this type, other than an ice storm one time. So yeah,
yeah.
fingers, knock on wood, I've been pretty lucky. But
Yeah,
yeah, a
the
lot
other
of
one I had was a
disasters.
software disaster, right? Where the upgrade caused all sorts of downtime, but it would happen progressively because it was a memory leak. I mean, it was a type of disaster, and I think that's the challenge is it comes from all sorts of directions.
That's true. And right now we are dealing with a lot, right? We got the fires happening in California again. We've got storms happening in Texas and a cold front that's causing all sorts of havoc in the Midwest. But John, like, you just mentioned it, but what are the different types of disasters that really healthcare should plan for, right? Like some are unpredictable. I don't think anybody could have predicted COVID and the shutdown would happen, but there are some other ones that maybe we should be a little bit more, prepared.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you have kind of two categories of disasters. You have the obvious ones and then the non-obvious ones. So if you live in Florida, then you're gonna plan for hurricanes, right? Like you're gonna do that. New Orleans, Houston, etc., right? Like you have to. If you're in the Midwest, you have tornado planning, right? Earthquakes in California, etc., right? So you have these regional ones, but I don't think New York thought it would be hit by Sandy, right? Hurricane Sandy, but it did, right? And so that was a bit of a surprise for them, let alone the fact that the real disaster wasn't really the hurricane. It was all the raining, which flooded their data center. It was in the basement, which, you look at that, you're like, why is it in the basement? But I've been in a lot of data centers that are in basements. Turns out there's a cooling effect probably in the basement and stuff like that. But anyway, that becomes a disaster. So there's all these unplanned, and COVID, another example. How could you have planned for that? How could you have known that something like that would happen so you could plan? So I think you have to look at both sides of it, which is what is my plan for the disasters that are a risk for my area? And by the way, every area has some. It could be the person digging up a trench outside of your hospital that then, cuts the internet cable. Okay, that's a disaster, a micro disaster, right? But it becomes a big disaster if you're working in the cloud. Fires can happen everywhere, flooding can happen a lot of places, right? So there's all sorts of disasters that could happen. And so, I think you need kind of the dual planning, which is like, hey, we know these are going to happen in our area, but what happens if something else crazy happens? How do we approach it?
Yeah, and I think I think you pointed out another category, right? Like self-inflicted
Mm,
disasters. An upgrade happens that causes all sorts of conflicts or errors to occur. Those types of things are also disasters. Putting on a new device, all of a sudden screwing something up, right? Like
yeah.
and
The
causing
CrowdStrike
havoc.
one is an example of that too, right?
Yeah. And so, I think those are reasonable things that you should plan for to say, okay, when that happens, we got to make sure we have a rollback. We just can't blindly install something. We also, want to make sure that our vendors don't do similar things, right? And that they have a plan. Should they install an update or an upgrade and it doesn't work, can they roll back? Do they have a plan to roll back, within 30 minutes or within a quick amount of time? Um, but I think one of the things I would suggest, and one thing I heard a long time ago from an old IBMer, was that rather than planning for disaster, because there's always a percentage of a disaster. Meaning, yeah, like what's the percentage chance of a hurricane hitting New York? It's pretty low, right? Like, and so people ignore it because they go, well, it's a low percentage, it's a low risk. But really plan for the impact it would have. So what if I cannot access my data center? Or
Yeah.
what if my data center goes completely offline for 7 days? Now you think about that and go, well, there's a number of ways that could happen. A hurricane, a flood, a fire, locusts, right? Like whatever. And you go, okay, well, that's actually more reasonable. That's probably got a very high percentage chance of happening. So let's plan for that. Let's make a plan for if our data center was down for 7 days, here's what we're going to do. And then it doesn't matter what disaster hit it, right?
Yeah.
Like, because I think when you think about disaster, it's like, yeah, am I really going to plan for an earthquake in Toronto? Probably not, right? But you're to your point, like someone severing the internet cable to my data center is just as impactful as a hurricane, could be, or an earthquake could be.
Yeah, and as we become more dependent on the cloud, those disasters are in some ways more likely to happen. Not even just the internet, but we saw it with the Kronos ransomware. All of Kronos went down. Okay, well, what was your disaster plan for that? And we're becoming more and more dependent on these services because I think that's almost the scarier part. I can almost deal with no power to my data center because it turns out there's solutions for that. There's UPSs, there's generators, there's all sorts of things that you can do. But, my third parties are actually the bigger risk from a business continuity perspective to me because I don't control it. It reminds me of what's happening with HIPAA and the new HIPAA regulations, how they're saying, hey, you're responsible for your third parties, which by the way, you've always kind of been responsible, but they're pushing forward the fact that you need to not just know that and have them sign that they are, responsible, but you need to actually ensure that they have been doing the security that they need to do. Another risk, that we're talking about from a business continuity standpoint. So it's pushing that forward. But I'll tell you this, every CIO and CISO that I talk to is like, that's really hard. Like it's hard to know if your third party vendor is doing it. And maybe they are when you asked them. 6 months later, that person's gone. Now they're not doing it. And how do you ensure that on an ongoing basis? That's just almost an impossible task. Trust is one thing, culture is another you can evaluate, but that only gets you so far. At the end of the day, they still have to live up to their promise or not.
Well, that's actually a great segue to the next question, John, I have for you, which is what which has the bigger impact on resiliency in healthcare? Is it the people side or technology?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's hard to choose one because they both are so Trump, are a challenge, So what's interesting is when you look at the technology, it's kind of like security. No one's going and breaching the firewall anymore because that's easy. That's hard to do, right? It's easy to secure or easier, and those solutions are in place to do it, right? So what do? They breach the people. That's why phishing's so popular and so effective at what it does. And so they want to take your credential, and so then they're in free and clear without a problem, right? And so I think the same is true to some degree with business continuity. It's great to roll out amazing backup systems and redundant data centers that and redundant internet connections. Those are all technologies that you can implement and do, but making sure that people know how to roll it over. making sure that the people know what the backup plan is when there is no access to your EHR system, right? Like though that is a big challenge. And so, I'd say the people is probably harder, than the technology, because the technology solutions are there, but training the people and getting them and convincing them to spend the time to do this, it's kind of like security. You spend a whole bunch of money hoping that you never have to use it. And that's a hard thing to sell to people.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, they are intertwined, right? It's hard to choose one or the other. I would definitely say that I think people have a bigger impact today than technology did. I think that wasn't true maybe a couple decades ago, where technology had a much bigger impact, right? The
Mm.
more ISDN lines you had, the more strength you had in your own data center, the more data centers you had. I mean, those were things you could do very easily. It just cost money, and they would really, really help you, right? Because back then we didn't have as many cyber threats and things that we do today. But to your point today, I think the biggest impact on resiliency is the people. It's both them knowing what to do in the case of a disaster, and then on second side, they're the vulnerable point, right? Like, the one person who knows this system, if they're not available because they can't get into work, like, what are you going to do? Right? Like,
Yeah.
that has a big, big impact on your resiliency, right? When your vendor isn't responsive to you, that's not a technology problem. That is a vendor relationship problem.
Mm.
That's so I think the people angle of resiliency is the one that has a bigger impact today. And I think that's much harder to work on as well. It's not like you can just go, oh, I'll just do this quick little thing and we're solved. It's solved, right? Like putting in a generator, right? Like if you have to go and figure out, like, every 6 months, I have to audit my partners, at least my high target, high risk partners, to see if their resiliency plan is up to snuff. Like, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But it has a big impact, right, on what you can or cannot do should that flood hit.
Yeah, and you have to tier them based on, the risk associated with that vendor. But what's interesting is I think it's actually equally difficult to get funding for technology redundancy as it is to get people to commit to, ensuring resiliency and training and practicing restoration of the backup, et cetera, and what's the backup plan if this goes down. Like testing that is hard. They're both hard, right? Getting funding for redundancy that you hope you never need or getting people to commit to something that you hope you never need, both of them are extremely challenging. The other angle to this for me is you look at things like the Change Healthcare outage. There wasn't resiliency. There isn't really resiliency. You're waiting on the vendor to create resiliency on their end. There's some things in healthcare you just right now at least can't create resilient patterns. When Kronos went down, the resilient pattern was do it on paper or some Excel spreadsheets, right? Like do your payroll in Excel spreadsheets. And it's like, because you can't just roll from Cronus to another vendor, like that you can't create that resiliency. Now, I'm hoping we will maybe, with the payer stuff, and being able to do claims, hopefully that will. But when the more people I talk to, the more I'm like, that's complicated, and I don't think it's not going to be a turn off, turn on thing. It's a 6 month migration, so you can't create the same redundancy that you can with an internet pipe, which is ubiquitous.
Right. Right. And hey, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Healthcare IT Today with John Lynn and Colin Hung. Today, we are talking about the need for resiliency and continuity in healthcare, especially in light of the fires in California and the storms that are happening in the Midwest, and in Texas in particular. But before we continue, I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Pure Storage. We all need a data platform that is reliable, efficient, and manageable. Data is growing and requirements are changing. What feels sufficient and efficient today may not be tomorrow. Just like our own personal health, it's important to routinely monitor your IT infrastructure. And that's why Pure Storage has created a quick quiz to help you start a conversation about whether your data platform is truly future ready. Or maybe it's just time to do a checkup. Go to healthcareittoday.com/pure storage to take a quick self-guided quiz to start you on the path to a more reliable and flexible data service. So, John, where's the bigger gap in healthcare today? Is it on the system side or is it on failover planning?
Yeah, it's a tough one because they both have challenges. We don't invest enough in this in many organizations, and I think there's a few exceptions. There's probably some outstanding organizations that work really hard on this, but what I like about the system redundancy side is that it's become a lot easier and a lot less expensive to be able to ensure the redundancy. And a lot of that is thanks to the cloud because you can have redundancy in the cloud without paying for it right away. So, if you're in one cloud data center and you need to roll it over to another, well, you don't necessarily have to pay for it until you do it, right? And so before you used to have redundant network switches and redundant servers and redundant storage and redundant like all of that needed to happen. Now your redundancy can be the cloud for many of the things that you're doing, and that can help you in a lot of ways. So, and even, kudos to our sponsor Pure Storage, who's one of the best at replicating the data across redundant data stores, and they even have a cloud offering as well, to be able to leverage some of those so that you can decrease the downtime and improve the business continuity. So the technology has improved in such a way that it's a lot less expensive to do it and make sure that you have the redundancy and resiliency you need, than you did previously. Now, when it comes to the planning, it feels like it's kind of like a cyclical thing, right? Now that we have the wildfires and we're talking about the crazy stuff that healthcare organizations are experiencing in California, everyone's going to wake up and say, "Oh, let's pull out that dusty plan and let's, let's do some work," right? We saw the same thing happen when Katrina hit New Orleans, right? There were all these sessions. What did we learn and what should you do? And everyone kind of woke up. Oh yeah, I should be ready for something like that happening, et cetera. So it's very cyclical, and hey, I mean, we suffer from it at Healthcare IT Today as well. Like how well are we doing backups? How well are we ensuring redundancy of it? It's cyclical because it's not in your face all the time when it's just working fine. But if you don't stay on top of it, then it catches up with you.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think the gap in healthcare is actually the failure to plan as opposed to the failure to, get the technology in place because we are moving to the cloud. And so by nature, a little bit more resilient than we were before when we had to depend on our own data centers. Also, I think just in general, upgrades are not as problematic as they were in the past, right? I still remember staying up very, very late and rolling back many, many times doing an upgrade. That's sort of almost unheard of nowadays, right? So I think quality wise, we're getting much better at those kinds of things. And also, I think to a certain degree, I think most people can handle a power outage, right? Like, people have learned their lesson to say, yeah, we need to have backup power. We need some UPCs and things under the desks of most important systems. Good news is most of our important systems are offline, off site now, right? They're not on the same physical space as we work in. So, but the failure to plan, like, yeah, I mean, to your point, like it's that dusty old manual that no one's looked at for 3 to 5 years, and now it's out of date because all of a sudden we have a new CT scanner that, all of a sudden there is no replicating that somewhere else, right? We don't have a plan for that, or there's some new service line that we spun up that we didn't account for back then in the old plan, and now what happens to those patients, right? And we've accepted this level of patient before where we didn't, or we don't now, and all those kinds of things. You need to make sure your plans are up to date, and that you account for things that are, a bit out of left field. Like no one, like losing access to your data center. I think maybe a week. Most people will go, okay, I can picture that. But like months where you can't even get to it, or like it burns down and like that company is goes out of business, right? That you were housing it at, like when, like what, who plans for that? Right. But the
Yeah.
point is you should, right? Given that you're kind of that mission critical. So I think the bigger gap is on that planning side.
Yeah. Well, I think the other problem is it's a bit like the EHR optimization. You do the EHR go live, you implement it, and then over time, your use of it degrades, right? Like you have to go back and re-optimize it and energize the effort. Well, the same thing happens for all the reasons that you just described. We do an upgrade, and so now that previous plan doesn't apply, right? We implement a new system, we implement a new, we acquire an organization. Okay, well, have we done it for them and all their systems, right? So your plan, essentially becomes outdated instantly. And then over time, it becomes more and more outdated, and we don't realize it because we're not checking it all the time. And I'm not sure there's a perfect solution to this other than revisiting it regularly. It's kind of like security. The same thing happens there, right? We're on top of it, and then it kind of over time you get less and less secure, and so you got to go revisit it and do it again. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge with all of this is that it's not a priority because it's not right in your face, and it becomes worse over time. It's a regressive disease that gets worse and worse as time goes on. But if I look at it and I say, okay, well, healthcare is challenging and it's important. We know this, right? And they need to be able to see patients. And quite frankly, we're becoming more dependent on IT every single day. And this is true for every caregiver in healthcare. But so I look at other industries like which ones should we mimic? Is it banking? Is it military? Is it the government? Is it the airlines that have to be 100% on? You'd almost say, hey, this is a life on the line here. And the way I look at it, though, is it's really more system dependent because it turns out the website for an airline doesn't actually cause safety or harm. It causes harm to their business, but it's not a airline safety issue, whereas the system that's running the plane is. And so I think that's what we have in healthcare a lot too. We have systems that are important to the business, and then we have systems that are important to saving lives.
You're right. I mean, as painful as it sounds, right? Like your HR system, payroll system going down, I mean, it's going to have a lot of upset people, but you're not impacting patient care, right? To your point, your website's down, so maybe they can't book online, but hopefully your call center is still available, so they can call in and make the appointment, right? Those systems, you can tolerate some downtime. Maybe that's lower priority in terms of your planning, versus I can't access the patient's record, so I can't figure out whether this prescription is going to adversely impact them, right? Like, or your partner clinics aren't able to access your system, and they're about to make a prescription that was going to cause this patient harm. Like that's a little bit more critical. Obviously, the OR systems and things like that. So yeah, to your point, I think we need to not mimic an entire industry, but pick and choose which systems need to be that fully redundant, never down, for more than 5 minutes kind of deal, right?
Yeah. I think the challenge is this: 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if the IT system went down, patient care wasn't really impacted that much. Yeah, maybe I printed off the schedule, or I didn't have the schedule quite right, or different things like that. That sucked, right? It hurt the workflow. And maybe I had to cancel some surgeries because of it, but they were elective or whatever it might be, right? That we weren't so dependent on the technology for the care that was being given. It was more for the operations, the billing, those types of things. And that's not true as much today. Like, I need to know your prescription history to be able to do it because they're often not bringing it in. Or, like I need to know, the data from another, previous visit. And I don't have the paper chart anymore to go and reference. And or even let alone, we're seeing this evolution, which is doctors being dependent on the clinical decision support. And that's going to become more and more true as LLMs start coming in with, where doctors are like, why should I memorize that when I can just ask technology for it? Which is exciting and scary at the same time, right? What happens when it goes down? Now that doctor can't see me and I'm not going to get the care that I need, like that's scary. So I think my point is that these systems are becoming more of a life-saving device versus before where it was more operations and billing.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think this is where I look at it and go, this is where you have, as a vendor, an opportunity to shine, right? Like if you can talk about these things, if you can highlight that you are on top of your own redundancy and your own recovery, I think that's going to make a difference. Um, because increasingly, maybe not to the point that you experienced, John, where if it's down, your job's on the line, but in some sense, that's true. Like lives may be on the line, right? And so
Mm.
if you're able to highlight as a vendor, like, no, we're taking this seriously, not only security, but also failover and recovery from when a disaster happens. We're ready for it. I think that's a peace of mind that will make a difference in the eyes of CIOs and IT leaders, because it's not something that they want to deal with. All right, you're dealing with a headache that maybe they haven't voiced. So, and you're right. I mean, if you're a mission critical system, you better be really good. And if you're, not, just the fact that you have a plan to recover within 50 minutes or the same day, like that's music to some people's ears, I think.
You know why I think they don't do it though? Is in many ways, if you prop up that I'm really secure, I'm really resilient, I'm really, XYZ, and then something happens, it's like egg on your face. And
True.
yeah, I don't think that's fair necessarily. And it probably depends on what the reason is that it goes down. Like, were you lying? You didn't actually do it, right? Versus, hey, we did all of this and then something still happened that we didn't expect, right? And so that's where transparency when something happens really matters. It wasn't negligence or dishonesty. It was actually a real incident that was almost impossible to plan for. That's very different. But I think that's their fear. If I'm a vendor, if I tout this too much and I push this too much and then something happens, then where does that leave me?
True. That's true. Although I will say, on the flip side, if you're on the patient side and or even as a consumer side, would you rather have someone tell you that hey, we make a pretty safe vehicle and we have this, crash system thing in the car and it's going to protect you 99% of the time, but there's still that 1%. Like I'd rather know that that's there and have them talk about it than not talk about
Yeah.
it at all, right?
Yeah.
Because that's going to make a difference in my purchasing decision.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
anyways, we're at the end of our time here, but thanks to all of you who tuned into this episode of Healthcare IT Today. And I want to thank again our sponsor for today, Pure Storage. Try the self-guided wellness quiz today at healthcareittoday.com/pure storage and take your first step towards a more reliable and future-ready data platform. For more details about our show, check out the programs page on healthcarenowradio.com and please share your voice and engage with the community on our social media channels using the hashtag HITSM. I'm Colin Hung, along with my friend and health IT collaborator, John Lynn. Thanks for listening and have a great week.